Good afternoon, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad Zishan Aslam, and I'm your host today. So, the topic for this session is Triumph and Despair in Search of Iran's Islamic Republic. And to discuss it, we have Mehran Kamrava from Georgetown University, Qatar, and he'll be discussing it with Marium Kamal from Punjab University. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This book is basically about Iran from the Pahlavis to the present. Though it does not discuss the Pahlavi regime that much, it's more about the post-revolution. Iran's Islamic revolution in 1979 was started with the visionary leadership of Khomeini at that time. So we have our host, our speaker today, the author of this book, Dr. Mehran Kamrava. He is native to Iran. He is from Iran, but currently based in US and working at the Qatar University and as a professor of government. So I welcome you here, sir. So before we start, I would like to give a brief request you for a brief introduction of the book and what was the objective, what was exactly in your mind before writing or completing this book, or such a cohesive or I say comprehensive book about Iran's multi-dimensional perspectives. So can you please give a brief introduction about your thoughts, what we were thinking before starting writing this book? Thank you.
Thank you. I need to start by thanking ThinkFest and the organizers and all the volunteers who are making all these events possible, and of course the sponsors. It's an absolute honor being here and a pleasure, and thank you very much. Just a minor correction, I work for Georgetown University, Qatar, not Qatar University. I wrote my PhD dissertation on Iran, and I started working on Iran in the 1980s. At that time, my generation of Iranians in the 1980s wanted to know what caused the revolution and what course the revolution would take. And I wrote my PhD dissertation on the causes of the Iranian Revolution, which eventually came out as a book. And then I moved on from Iran intellectually, and I wrote about a number of other topics. But as part of my DNA, as part of my ever-present intellectual curiosity, I couldn't do away with the country. And so in early 2000s, I went back to the country academically, and I wrote another book on Iran that looked at the time at intellectual currents that were going on. The early 2000s were a time of tremendous excitement and a time of intellectual fascination, not just for academics studying Iran, but also for activists inside Iran. The reform movement was producing really exciting and cutting edge and innovative ideas inside Iran. It turned out that by 2009, the reform movement was dead. And again, I moved on intellectually from Iran. But that moving away from Iran again turned out to be temporary, and I couldn't completely dispense with it. And once again, I found myself drawn to it inescapably, and I had to rediscover it intellectually. And that intellectual rediscovery manifested itself in this book that took me back to Iran beginning in 2017. And it took me several trips to Iran and endless conversations with academics, activists, people in the policy world, people outside of the policy world, to articulate a compelling research question. What is it that I want to study about Iran. I knew I wanted to study Iran. I didn't know quite what. And finally, I decided that one of the main reasons that one of the main questions that I needed to answer for myself was, what are the sources of state strength in Iran? Why is the state still standing despite endless self-inflicted wounds, despite the maximum pressure campaign, despite the full pressure of a superpower being brought upon it, and despite the misguided policies of the state, and despite multiple systematic contradictions within the Iranian political system. And so it was within that assumption and those questions guiding me that I wrote this book.
Wonderful. The book, which really, I want to congratulate you to writing such a balanced perspective of Iran, which is a combination of the political, economic, socio-cultural, and also addressing different current issues as the women empowerment, youth as well. So coming back to your question, when you said the compelling perspectives which force you to write about, to find out how the state continued from 1979. If I look at the Islamic Revolution, they faced 8 years war with Iraq, US sanctions, pressure from Israel, and there were internal dimensions as well. There were so many groups at that time beside the Islamic Revolution which wanted their share in power at that time after Pahlavis. So there were multiple issues, and the rigidity of the Islamic Revolution itself, which was again a very big question for the people of Persia, for people of Iran to accept that Islamic version. So after all these constraints, how this revolution sustained all the odds throughout. And it's not only internal dynamics, it's the external pressure which is continued till date. If you look at the Trump policies, which you have again discussed in it, and how they are still sanctioning Iran in terms of economy, in terms of so many other things. So here I want to know exactly why the system survived after all the odds.
That's an excellent question, and that's the primary question that animated this research. And I came up with 3 or 4 main reasons. First and foremost, one of the interesting things for me was that that the Iranian political system is deeply ideological. I hadn't discovered this. We know that it's an Islamic republic. We know that Iran is a political system that is vaguely ideological. But we haven't quite studied the depth to which this state is committed to the idea of velayat faqih, the rule of the supreme jurisconsult. And what does velayat faqih mean? Is it a continuation of the imamat? What is it? So the first reason for the regime's resilience is its deep ideological commitment. Second, I discovered that it is a political system that is highly complex, far more complex than the Shah's system. And by a political system that's complex, I mean a political system that has multiple penetrative roots deep within society. It is firmly anchored in Iranian society, and it has its tentacles in multiple roots. Everything from the local mosque to the local neighborhood Basij organ, volunteer organ, to the Friday prayers, to Khamenei's, the supreme leader's representatives throughout the country, and throughout the different parts of the country, throughout the different provinces. And then another interesting, eye-opening revelation for me was that this is a political system that has a very complex and complicated set of legitimacies. It has two levels of legitimacy. It has a broad electoral legitimacy, whereby up until the 2001 election, Iranian elections would routinely attract upwards of 55 to 60% of the electorate. So if we take electoral participation as a measure of legitimacy, it's a broadly legitimate political system up until 2001, where only 40% of the population voted. And the other is that it has deep ideological legitimacy among something like 20% of the population. And that 20% is deeply committed to the ideas and ideals of the Islamic Republic. And so for them, the Velayat Faqih is a living, tangible manifestation of the Imamat. It isn't just an abstract idea. It isn't just a political institution. It is something in which they deeply believe.
Can you further elaborate the concept of Velayat Faqih for the audience?
Sure.
How it is working in Iran. Initially, it was the position which was given to Khomeini, and now it is from the last 10 to 20 years with Khamenei, I believe. Exactly. From 1989, it's with Khamenei.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Velayat Faqih had long existed in Shia theology in Iran, but it was Ayatollah Khomeini who in 1971 wrote a book in which he articulated the concept but deeply politicized it. Up until that point, the Velayat Faqih was loosely taken to mean guardian of the needy in society, moral guardian of the needy. Khomeini gave it a new innovative interpretation in which the Velayat Faqih became a living, ruling figure, a political figure that ruled.
Moral guardian or the interpreter of that?
No, a moral guardian. Up until broadly, Velayat Faqih, up until Khomeini's interpretation, was seen as a moral guardian of society.
But according to your book, his position was extremely. He was the person who basically dealt with the foreign policy, the formation of Hezbollah, and how basically the role, how to counter Israel and Saudi Arabia and US. So everything was basically, he was in control of the foreign policy as well as the external policies as well. Beside being a moral guardian, as per the manuscript, that he has to be the moral guardian.
Yeah, we have two versions of Khomeini. We have Khomeini before the revolution, where he's the philosopher, and then we have Khomeini after the revolution, where he's the actual post-revolutionary ruler of a political system that, by virtue of being post-revolutionary, is inherently fragile. And then he has to engage in consolidating the political system. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. So Khomeini, after 1979, as the ruling Velayat Faqih, then he becomes the Velayat Faqih Mutlaq, or Velayat Mutlaq Faqih, where the absolute Velayat Faqih, that's where Mutlaq comes from. And in that sense, he becomes the chief executive of the country, to whom the president reports.
Here, considering, according to your book, that he was the fourth in number, according to being the marja in Qom. He was not from the top three Maraja.
Absolutely, yes.
So, like being on the fourth number, ignoring the first three Maraja, and at that time also the people of Iran or the they were not in support of his politicization or political role of Khomeini in Iran, because they thought that religion should not support such kind of political initiative. So how he survived, basically, that is basically maybe the indigenized reason, the anger against the monarchy of Pahlavi, whatever the people of Iran were suffering. So they saw an initiative in him in terms of religion, in terms of politics, in terms of foreign policy, because he was a non-figure exiled for many years in Najaf first, in Iraq, and later he was not allowed to go to Kuwait. After that, he went to Paris, where he wrote the first constitution. In fact, he asked for to write the constitution from his friend Habib, according to your book. Which was again borrowed from the French constitution, which is a quite liberal constitution that was changed according to the need of later was changed. So it was the constitution, the liberal constitution was accepted at that time initially when it was wrote, when you are asking Habib, who was living in Paris, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the drafting of the constitution is discussed extensively in the book. There's lots of controversies because he did commission Khomeini did commission the initial constitution, and there was no mention of the Vilayat Faqih. There was complete separation of state and religion. And then the liberals made a strategic mistake. They said Khomeini was ready to go with the constitution. The liberals said, well, this is an undemocratic process whereby this constitution was drafted. Let's convene an assembly. Let's have a deliberative process whereby the constitution is discussed and drafted. And through the process of electing members of that assembly, the clergy mobilized. They won the elections to the assembly, and they were able to monopolize the deliberations of the assembly of experts for the writing of the constitution. And that's when they incorporated Khomeini's concept of Vilayat Faqih into the constitution. So the liberals made a strategic mistake whereby they rejected a liberal constitution and ended up inadvertently producing a very non-liberal constitution.
There was division between the clergy as well at that time about Vilayat Faqih.
It was not a universally accepted concept. In fact, as you mentioned, Khomeini's position of eminence wasn't universally accepted within the clerical establishment. He was known, he was not a non-entity, but he was not one of the most prominent of the thinkers. But we all know revolutions are not for the faint of heart. Revolutions are moments of tremendous excitement, and whoever is better able to capitalize on that popular excitement can ride the revolutionary wave more effectively. So while you have a number of deeply philosophical theologians in Qom deliberating and talking about the fine points of theology, Khomeini is the one that has that knows where the popular pulse is and knows how to capture the popular revolutionary mood and how to lead the revolution in a fashion that he wanted it to be led.
But later, with after Khomeini's time period, we can see when Khamenei comes, then the constitution is amended, because Khamenei was not a marja. So again, they compromise on a certain points which was required at Khomeini's time. It was not present at Khamenei's time. So here we see there is kind of politicization of the system, like amending things according to the need. So there comes here, which distinguish a different sphere of people who are basically the political elite or the ruling elite, who are changing things according to their own interest.
Definitely. So as you mentioned, in the original constitution, the Vilayat Faqih had to also be a source of emulation, a marja taqlid. And then once Khomeini died or was nearing his final days, they looked around and they realized there are really no marja who had the same stature, same charisma, and same level of political commitment who could step in. So a small group of 20 people were convened by Khomeini and charged with coming up with a series of constitutional amendments. And one of the main constitutional amendments was that the requirement of marja'iyat was dropped from the position of Velayat Faqih. And so what we see is that increasingly, as the life of the Islamic Republic progresses from 1979 onward, we have political considerations, or what Khomeini called maslahat, expediency, trump religious principles. And so again and again, expediency became the rule of the day. So much so that within the new constitution, a new council, a new branch of the government was established whose specific goal is to determine the system's maslahat, the system's interest.
It's the same as law of necessity in Pakistan. You can understand and relate it very well. The law of maslahat. So here, if you can sum up the political perspective so we can shift to the next aspect of economy, because the economy part of this book, initially when I read it was the political perspective, the initial chapters were very burdening because they were very similar with the kind of authoritarian perspectives leading, very rigid, dominating. But the economic perspective is more brightening or basically facilitating. Such a rigid or authoritarian regime led a better economy. So what was the perspective or the idea behind that? How this happened?
Yeah, I should say, as we all know, revolutionaries, if they succeed, by definition, they're very good revolutionaries. Usually, however, they make lousy rulers, and they make even worse economists. And the Iranian revolutionaries were no exception. Initially, the Iranian revolutionaries, when they came to power in the early 1980s, introduced a statist model of economic development whereby the state would control the commanding heights of the economy, and by doing so would ensure redistribution of economic resources and economic wealth. And this was the dominant pattern of economic development throughout the 1980s. Once the war with Iraq ended in 1988, the state decided, for a whole variety of reasons, to liberalize the economy and to engage in privatization. And by engaging in privatization, the state suddenly discovered that because of sanctions, it's not as if it was in a condition or in a position to invite Western investors to come and invest inside the country. So by liberalizing, what it did was it inadvertently created a very politically connected oligarchy who could then capture state contracts. But then the one institution inside the country that could actually carry out these huge developmental projects was the Revolutionary Guards, which, now that the war had ended, no longer had the war theater to engage in. They turned their attention domestically to economic development. So in many ways, the Revolutionary Guards in the late 1980s and 1990s followed the model of the People's Liberation Army of China, whereby they became increasingly involved in infrastructural development, in various economic projects, aided by people who were politically connected, who could get the state contracts. And so beginning in the 1990s, when we have this privatization drive. We have an abandoning of the statist model of earlier, a growth of oligarchs, uneven privatization, and a growth of income disparities and levels of inequality throughout the country. Fast forward 20 years, today what we have is an economy that's in utter confusion because it's got some statist elements, it's got some state-supported or state-controlled entities, it's got some entities that are tied to the Revolutionary Guards, it's got a number of private enterprises. So it's an economy that is embroiled or characterized by multiple contradictions.
Definitely. And even the defense sector was also enhanced and increased in number of missiles and their which further strengthened Iran's security. So if we can see related to Pakistan, we can see whenever we had an authoritarian regimes in Pakistan, we had better economy. So the same here, I think revolutionaries, they continued, maybe because it is the rigidity of the nature of that regime and the vertical hierarchy and the command structure, which makes things happen in a better way as compared to the civilian government. So more or less what I have seen in this region, whether it's Iran, Afghanistan or Pakistan, more or less definitely we have similarities in the form of government. So here we can, if you can add something about the defense sector and the need for that, because again, if we look at Pakistan's politics, the defense sector is enhanced and increased during the last 40 to 50 years. We spent a lot on this sector. Similarly, I have read in your book that you people have increased in the defense sector and the missile, and it was totally a reaction after the US sanction.
Yes.
And how you people basically managed. And this is this resilience and this sense of nationalism, though you are talking a bit against nationalism, but here from Pakistan, we see a very strong sense of nationalism in Iran and unity.
Right.
So maybe it is basically indigenized to the Persian Empire and the civilizational background, which definitely has its impact by now.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because this sense of nationalism that is deeply ingrained among Iranian policymakers was another eye-opening lesson that I learned, because we have always assumed that the stewards of the Islamic Republic are more Islamists than nationalists. And I discovered that actually they're deeply committed to Iran's national interests and the whole idea of Iranian nationalism. And as you mentioned, the war with Iraq was a formative period, because as Iran was being bombarded by Iraqi chemical weapons, as Iran was being bombarded by missiles, nobody would sell Iran any defense technologies. And I remember as a young boy during the Iran-Iraq war, living in the United States, Iranians would send soldiers that had been victims of Iraqi chemical attacks to the United States for treatment with these awful blisters. And the Americans would say, oh, no, these were not Iraqi chemical weapons, Iranian chemical weapons. The wind blew them back on Iran. Then the United States said, no, well, Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons on his own people. So this formative period of the war with Iraq resulted in Iranians deciding that they had to develop their own indigenous defense industry. And they couldn't make sophisticated jet fighters, but they decided instead on missiles technology and on unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. And so today we see that Iranian missiles and Iranian drones, particularly as being used by Russia in the Ukraine theater, in the Ukraine war, are something that everybody is taking note of. So I think if you were to talk to Iranian policymakers, they would point to their defense sector as one of their shining accomplishments.
Without any external support.
With despite external sanctions.
Despite, definitely. So if I sum up your talk about that, what were the causes that made the Iranian Islamic Revolution to sustain? That the first thing which you have mentioned, that the ideological support to the system, which
Yes.
is definitely has been driven from the religious beliefs which existed. Majority of the people of Iran are basically belongs to the Shia sect.
That's
so
right.
they supported directly or indirectly,
Right.
consciously or unconsciously, they supported that Islamic revolution. The second, the political understanding and the penetrative complex system also supported. They wanted a regime change then Pahlavi.
Exactly.
So here, really, I want for my audience to tell them exactly the reason behind these revolution. What was the issues, the major issues with Pahlavi's regimes that supported or built the narrative against this regime, and they wanted change in regime, because revolution means transformation,
Yes, yes.
which totally transformed Iran
Right.
from a monarchy to an Islamic regime.
Right. Revolutions require three basic ingredients: a public that is yearning for change, for a revolution in every sense, a leadership group, a group that can capitalize on and direct that popular anger, because by itself the people don't erupt and they don't organize themselves. So somebody has to capitalize on that. And the third key element is the vulnerability of the incumbent system, cracks within the system. And so if you have any two of those three elements, a revolution will not happen.
Oh, sorry, what was the first one?
Popular yearning, popular desire for some sort of revolutionary change. And so in 1978, 79, the stars aligned. By the way, I should say the fact that you need all these three ingredients simultaneously is the main reason why true revolutions of historic kinds are so rare. 1789 in France, in Russia in 1917, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam. There are really a handful of historic revolutions of the category to which Iranian revolution belongs. Revolution is one of those terms that's often used and abused by politicians. Oh, revolution of this, revolution of that. But the Iranian revolution belonged to this rare historical category, as you mentioned. And we had all three ingredients. We had mass unhappiness with the monarchical political system because it was deeply corrupt, deeply repressive. It engaged in what seemed at the time like frivolous spending, wasting of national resources, national treasures. You had a group, Khomeini, that and his band of highly clever political activists who were able to capitalize, manipulate, and direct this popular anger towards political targets and political strategies. And you had ultimately the Iranian military that abandoned the monarchical system. When the Iranian military, at the height of the revolution, when the monarchy needed it the most, declared its political neutrality in the people's conflict. And so then you have a transformation.
True. Here I can relate it, like during the Arab Spring back in 2010 and 11, lots of people at TV said that all the Arab world basically into a revolutionary mode and Pakistan will definitely have a revolution. But neither of these three ingredients were never present in Pakistan at this time. And we have never seen in the last 20 years that we are gathered or we support just single, or we are all on a single motive. So if we today ask the thing which I have observed in this book, their clarity and focused about exactly, they know what is or who is their enemy. If now we ask the people in Pakistan here, who is your enemy? Some people will say it's US, terrorism, poverty, India, Kashmir, or inherited. So this discarded mindset of Pakistani people here never set the people on a ground for a revolution or transformation. So this is the major thing which I have observed in this book, that there is a clarity. They wanted a regime change. They were angry about that regime. And the last thing, which is basically Pakistan is facing, crisis of leadership. Khomeini gave them an alternative leadership, which was basically against the Pahlavi regime at that time. So here I wanted to just bridge the gap or relate the perspective with Pakistan's politics here. Now, if we come to the, according to my understanding, I divided the book into 3 sections. The first political, the second economic, and the last is more about socio-cultural perspective. If we, before going to the question answer session, if I want you to comment on the women empowerment, we recently have seen Mahsa Amini's issue, and really elaborate the major reasons about that and the youth perspective after the post-revolutionary, because now things have changed with the globalization, digitalization, access to social media, internet. Things are changing. Even youth in Pakistan are changing. Definitely there's something very common in Iran as well. So the things which I have observed, if you can talk about that perspective, because one thing which really irritating me, why hijab? Why we relate the phenomena of hijab to the women empowerment? Why it's not education? Why it's not representation, political representation? Why it is not more assertive role in policy making? There's so many things other than the hijab which can empowerment, talks about the women empowered. Why the element of hijab? And this element of hijab has been focused so many times that if I remember that during Zain al-Abidin's time period in Tunisia, he abandoned hijab in the public office. It was not allowed to wear hijab. Being a Muslim state, they said if you are a public employee, you cannot wear hijab. This is in Tunisia during Zain al-Abidin's time, before the Arab Spring time. So why basically you, this kind of initiatives, they basically deal with the women as an object. So this is the main focus here. Like when you're talking about women empowerment, let's take about a woman which can really make a contribution, which can make really, her role can support something, can bring a change.
Thank you. Yes, 2 chapters of the book are devoted, the last 2 chapters. One is devoted to questions of identity, and then the other is devoted to questions of social groups, and in particular the relationship between each of these groups and the state. And when it comes to women, my argument is that this has been, as I mentioned, it's a deeply ideological state. And part of that ideology is a deep-seated fear of women's empowerment. And so what we have are a bunch of policymakers with quite archaic and insecure mindsets that are deeply fearful of women. So that at the state level, you have this deep fear of women. At the societal level, the exact opposite has been happening. Because if we look at statistics, which I present in the book, an overwhelming majority of university entrants are women. An overwhelming majority of people who then graduate from universities are women. And at the same time, because of the way that the political economy and state policies are structured, Iran has one of the lowest rates of female involvement in the formal labor market. So you have, in other words, you have a highly educated female labor force of labor age, of productive employment age, who is barred formally and informally from entering into the labor market. And at the same time, you have social change, you have a change in values, you have an increase in the age of women, in the marriage age of women. You have a reduction of the number of children. You have an increase, even the government has acknowledged, you have an increase in the age, in the rate of what are called white marriages, where couples cohabit without being formally married. And so all of these social indicators show that women's position has changed, and women have been socially and culturally empowered, but that empowerment is being politically blocked. And so as a result, you have this explosion that occurs with the death of Mahsa Amini. You ask a brilliant question. Why is it hijab? And the answer is, in my opinion, two. Incidentally, I should say that the question that you ask, why is it over the question of hijab and not female economic empowerment, female political empowerment, greater female representation, is the same question that's being asked by women inside Iran. And they're saying, yeah, hijab is important, or whether or not we have a choice, that's important. We have much deeper concerns that go into our lifestyles, choices, meaningful choices, living standards, and that's what's important. And the answer is two. One is that hijab is one of the most significant, visible symbols of the Islamic Republic. You enter Iran, you enter the country before the plane lands, everybody, all the women put on their hijab. Up until then, they have their tight jeans, they have their revealing outfits. As soon as the plane is about to land and they enter Iran, hijab goes, and it's the most visible symbol of the Islamic Republic. That's one. The second is Europe's fixation, the West's fixation with hijab, seeing it as the symbol of women's oppression in Islam. And so the fact that Iran's expat media that so blindly follows the Western narrative about the country and perpetuates a kind of superficial narrative of the country, that is another reason why Mahsa Amini's tragic death has been reduced to the question of hijab, glossing over much deeper societal concerns with which Iranian women grapple on a daily basis. Hijab being one of them, but there's employment, there is legal restrictions on women, there are multiple political restrictions, there are restrictions in barriers to entry into the formal labor market, and all sorts of other restrictions.
This is more a Western or media propaganda, I believe, which is highlighting the issue, because I have seen this issue with Afghanistan as well. Afghanistan's people are facing the major issue, which is 90% of Afghan people are facing the poverty issue. And only maybe 10% of Afghani women wants to go for education. So if you just compare 10% versus 90% poverty, which issue is more important? Poverty issue is more important than the education. But it is continuously highlighted on the media that the Afghan women are not allowed to go for the education. So this is the basic, when the basic needs are not fulfilled, so how you can think about empowerment and education? So the poverty over there in Afghanistan, there's so many issues which highlighted negatively by the media. And this is the scholars' basically job to explain and to clarify and to make the people think in this way, that how to analyze the right thing and what the media is propagating for. So we have touched most of the topics, I think. Only we left with the foreign policy of Iran, the influence that is very much obvious in Syria and Iraq now. And it is more of political and ideological influence with the Shia perspective, with the obviously political, and with the dominance against Saudi Arabia in the region. It's a clear ideological clash between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So if you can touch this area of research as well.
Yeah, interesting. I actually make the point that Iran's foreign policy is driven by deep strategic concerns rather than ideological concerns. So, for example, we know that Azerbaijan Republic is a Shia majority country, and in Azerbaijan's conflict with Armenia, Iran has been firmly and squarely on the side of Armenia, which is a Christian majority country. Iran was deeply, up until 2011, deeply involved with Hamas, which is a Sunni group, and it does have Hezbollah in Lebanon or other groups. So Iran's foreign policy is strategically driven by the country's national interests. But when ideology and identity help further those strategic objectives, of course, they're employed instrumentally. So the fact that Iran's strategic objective has been to have non-state allies, actors that are non-state allies throughout the region. So if those non-state allies happen to be Shia, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, all the better. If they happen to be Sunni, like Hamas, then so be it. And so it isn't an ideological foreign policy per se, but it is a strategically driven foreign policy which also instrumentally employs ideology when that ideology helps further national interests and solidify strategic objectives. And so we see this. Now, Iran decided during the war with Iraq, because of its, the question would arise, why non-state actors? Why does Iran have proxies? Well, because it doesn't have friends. And, if you talk to any Pakistani senior diplomat, they can tell you that Pakistan, for example, has long tried to mediate between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iranians have been firmly in support of it. And the Saudis say, we stay out because we don't want to talk to the Iranians. And we've got the Americans on our corner. We don't need to talk to the Iranians. And so the Iranians, not having been able to establish formal relations with those groups they want to establish relations with, countries, then they go to these non-state actors. So better have an ally in the Houthis, for example, or in some Iraqi militia group than not have any relations with anybody in the region.
Thank you. Before we conclude, if you think anything left you want to highlight regarding this book with the audience, you want to discuss, which I haven't yet, before we start the question answer session, how much time is left for us?
10 minutes.
So 10 minutes. It's up to you.
Just very quickly, one of the things that I think bears keeping in mind is that people, us, we are not inherently political. We might be politicized in certain days or certain, maybe even for a few weeks, but ultimately everybody, people want to go about their daily routine, their jobs, their life, so in a country like Iran, one of the most compelling sources of state support is political apathy. The fact that people are politically apathetical, that 20% that is deeply committed is in support of the state. The other 80%, overwhelming majority of those guys, want to go about, make their living, make their, visit relatives, visit family on Fridays, go on their picnic. And on occasion, they get animated, they get excited, they come and get mobilized, and they protest. But so one of the most compelling sources of political rule for a government, for a political system like Iran, is apathy supported by fear. And so that, I think, is important to keep in mind, and that's why I don't anticipate that the current protests would have tangible political results. What we are seeing is a moment of expression of cultural change that I mentioned too. Cultural change occurring deep within society that has now come to the surface. I think that's the Iranian government protesting. And but anyway.
So then, thank you very much. And now the house is open for questions.
Yes, please. Question.
Aha.
Hello. Shalom. I've got two questions. One is, how do you see the future of Iranian revolution? Particularly, change is something a constant phenomenon, and it happens all the time. And how the revolution is reshaping itself to meet the needs of the modern times. My second question is, how is the life of the general masses in Iran, particularly of the youth? Because we see that although we have a political system in Iran, it's a republic, but most of the power resides with the people, Maraje and Vilayat Faqih people, who they never elect, or imposed on them. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer each question or take a few? Let's answer this one. If I knew what the future of Iran would hold, do you think I would be here? I would be writing some bestseller predicting the future. So how do you see it? Iran, first of all, my last name Kamrava means someone who loves life. I'm by nature an optimistic guy, and I see the future bright. It's a tremendously rich country in terms of human resources, very much like Pakistan, lots of bright minds. It's just you have a political system that blocks that. But I see Iran as a country in the throes of change. And all of us have a finite life, even if we at some point become the Vilayat Faqih. The current Vilayat Faqih is in his 80s. He's not going to be around forever. And once he goes, there's going to be some change. He's been around, he's been calling the shots since 1989. That's more than 30 years. Now, how that change is going to be, to me, it's going to be more than a change in style, because there's bound to be some changes, even if not in institutions, but certainly in the conduct and function of institutions. For at least, it took Khamenei 10 years to consolidate himself as the Vilayat Faqih. For the first 10 years, he was under the overbearing shadow of Rafsanjani. And so whoever comes next is going to be under the overbearing shadow of the Revolutionary Guards, because there's no Rafsanjani. Now, would the Revolutionary Guards, at some point, all revolutions have to deliver. They can't just live on promises, particularly if those promises end up being empty promises, particularly if you have a restless youth like the one you have in Iran. You have youth balls, you have an economy that is in dire straits. And so my sense is that Iran has no option but to probably follow the Chinese model, whereby it becomes, Iran becomes as much of an Islamic republic as China is a people's communist republic. Theoretically, politically, but not in terms of actual function. And so I think you're in for a change in Iran. And I think the youth, the government has no option but to at some point cater to the demands of the youth.
Hello, sir. My name is Syed Bakir Hussain. Sir, I have a few observations and which I want to share and want you to highlight. So, first of all, you mentioned about the Nagorno-Karabakh war, Azerbaijan and Armenia's war. Sir, in Pakistan, our government has tried to, Islamize the entire nation, but still we have vibrant Baloch, Sindh, Pashtun cultures. So, do you see any cultural underpinnings between Azeris residing in Iran and the Persians residing there? Secondly, sir, when you talk of Pakistan, there are few arguments that are given that, a revolution is not possible in Pakistan because, first of all, the middle class has specialization of jobs. Everybody has his own vocation, so have their difference of interest. And whereas the poor people are, busy and not too bothered about revolution because they have to think about what are they going to eat, at the end of the day. So how did the Iranians overcome this? Because how did they overcome this, the gap between haves and have-nots, and how did they, ultimately succeed in bringing about a revolution? And lastly, sir, Ibrahim Raisi comes from the clergy himself, and the Khomeini himself is elected, not by the ulamas. I don't remember the name of the council exactly. So I don't think with the passing away of this Khomeini, there would be any blockage to, the coming Khomeini in future. So, and with Mahsa Amini case and Ibrahim Raisi on the other end, we see, a great clash coming together of the opposing sides. So where do you see the future? How is this going to unfold?
Yeah, I hope I remember all the questions, and let me try to answer. So, similar to Pakistan, Iran has a very rich ethnic mosaic of different communities. And one of the interesting things that we see is that in the Islamic Republic, unlike in Shah's regime, but in the Islamic Republic, we have an Iranian of Arab origin who is Shamkhani, who is National Security Advisor, Chief Security Advisor to Khamenei, and former Defense Minister. Khamenei himself has an Azeri roots. And so, you have a number of Azeri senior policymakers. So within the inner circle of Islamic Republic, you have that rich mosaic itself. And so, again, Americans often, or people outside, talk about Iran breaking up along ethnic lines. And unless you listen to the rhetoric of Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, that is more of a fantasy than a reflection of reality. Then, second question was about revolutions. One thing about revolutions is that if you have a political system that has a semblance or any kind of a democracy, whether that democracy is meaningful or if it's safety valve, if it's elite democracy, so long as you have that kind of rotation of elites, then it becomes incredibly difficult to have a breakdown of the political system and kind of system vulnerability. Because that elite rotation at the top, no matter how superficial, kind of enables the system to sustain itself and maintain itself. And so Iran didn't have that elite rotation at the top. The Shah called all the shots. And once he got cancer and once he lost his footing, the writing was on the wall. The end was there. Finally, about Raisi and Khamenei, there is an assembly of experts. And this assembly of experts is made up of elected clerics. And their primary job is to appoint the next or elect the Velayat Faqih. Now, part of the deal of the Assembly of Experts is that they say they have a standing committee whose job it is to constantly assess the credentials of potential future Velayat Faqih. So just as Khamenei's ascension to the position of Velayat Faqih was completely unexpected and no one predicted it, my sense is that the next Velayat Faqih, whoever he might be, is someone that we will be completely surprised about. Everybody thinks it might be Raisi, but you know, Raisi has being elected president was the kiss of death. Probably that's why Khamenei engineered his election so that he doesn't become the next Velayat Faqih. The signal just told us we have 2 minutes. So.
Okay. Let's take the question quickly, all of them. So
Sure, I'll be very quick.
Yes.
Your comment on this, are revolutions good or bad? Because what we've seen from the history, revolutions are either chaotic or repressive. Secondly, do you think that the 79 amendment of Iranian army gave the current Iranian administration the lesson? That's why they sort of organized a parallel military in the shape of IRGC.
My question is a bit relatable to that. I'm just concerned about the current situation of Iran, the movement that we are witnessing these days, which is Zan Zindagi or the human life. You talked about the popular yearning. Can this movement be popular yearning to change the internal popularity of Iran from apolitical to political?
Okay, and last.
So, ma'am, my name is Fahd. I'm from Lums. My question is that, as you said, that Iran is deeply ideological state. How? My question is simple. My question is that how can Iran play a positive role to unite the Muslim Ummah like OIC, because the future of the world lies in Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
And if we kept fighting with each other, then how can we become a united Ummah?
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, let me just.
Is paranoid of or the imposition of hijab, because
Yeah.
all the West talks about is the imposition of hijab, not the hijab itself. So if you could.
Yeah, let's get together over some Pakistani kebab and I'll tell you if revolutions are good or bad. But look, just very quickly, there are 3 ideal types of revolutions. There are spontaneous revolutions of the kind that, they are spontaneous. They happen on their own. The state collapses. Out of that state collapse, leaderships arise. This happened in France in 1789, in Iran in 1979, in Russia in February of 1917. There are planned revolutions where people plan revolutionary takeover of the state. Happened in Cuba, in China, in Vietnam. Planned revolutions, guerrilla movements. And then there are what I've called negotiated revolutions. South Africa in 1994, Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, negotiated revolutions. In spontaneous revolutions and planned revolutions, particularly spontaneous revolutions, you have reign of terror in order to consolidate. You decide if a reign of terror is good or bad. I am I have the luxury of just writing about these things and not coming up with a value judgment. But in France, we had the guillotine. In Iran, we had the decade-long reign of terror of the 1980s. Are revolutions good or bad? You be the judge. What was the other? I forget the other question. The current movement is not, it doesn't have political consequences. What the state has done, it hasn't disbanded the Gashte Ershad, the morality police, but it is not enforcing it is not enforcing hijab. So women are now walking in the streets, young women, in droves without the hijab, almost daring Gasht Irshad. And that's not happening. So the consequences are much more cultural rather than political. Finally, can Iran play a constructive role in uniting the Ummah? As long as sectarian divides exist, I don't see Iran and Saudi Arabia being on the same page, and they play to different audiences.
So we have the last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. I have a question on the economy side of the Iran. The question is, why not Iran is so failed to use his oil resources in the region? Because all the things we see, that the oil prices, climate change, everything, blah, blah, is associated also with the resources of the oil.
Yeah.
Iran is the second largest country of the oil resources. Why not their presence there in the region in terms of the oil?
2 words, quick answer. Policy paralysis. They cannot decide on a policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful discussion on the book. It covered all the aspects related to Iran, whether it's political, economic, social, culture, the current movement in Maisa Amini. So thank you very much for being here with us today, for being in Pakistan, and thank you for your contribution for all the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.